What? My look-alike with my husband? How's that possible? I'm an orphan. I'm an orphan. This can't be real.
Claire Bennett was folding laundry when her phone rang, and the first 4 words her best friend said would end the life she thought she was living. "Your husband is here." A pause, then quieter, like the words themselves were afraid to be spoken. "With a woman who looks just like you." Claire didn't answer. She didn't breathe. Somewhere in a downtown cafe 3 miles away, a man she had shared a bed with for 8 years was sitting across from a face that was not her own, and yet was. The same eyes. The same smile. The same woman, it seemed, standing in 2 places at once. This is not a story about an affair. This is a story about what happens when the person you trusted most turns out to be the one holding a truth big enough to break you in half. Denise Ortiz had never been the dramatic type. She was the friend who double-checked before speaking, who waited for facts before forming opinions, which is exactly why her voice trembling through the phone that afternoon meant something was terribly wrong. She had gone into the cafe for a coffee before an appointment, glanced toward a corner booth out of nothing more than habit, and stopped cold. There was Mark Bennett, Claire's husband of 8 years, leaning across the table toward a woman whose face belonged, impossibly, to his own wife. Not similar, not resembling, identical, down to the small mole near the left eyebrow that Claire had complained about since high school. Denise stood frozen near the door for nearly a full minute before she found the courage to step outside and call the one person who needed to know. Claire hung up the phone and stood in the middle of her living room, the folded towel still in her hands, her mind refusing to organize itself into anything resembling a coherent thought. Mark had told her he was working late, finishing quarterly reports before a client dinner. He had kissed her forehead on his way out that morning, the same way he always did. Unremarkable, routine, the kind of gesture a person only notices once it becomes suspicious in hindsight. Now she was replaying every detail of that kiss, searching it for evidence of a lie she hadn't known to look for. She thought of their wedding day, of the 8 years that followed, of every ordinary Tuesday that had built the architecture of a marriage she believed she understood completely, and she thought of the woman in that cafe, wearing her face like a mask she had never given permission to be worn. Before we go further into what Claire discovered that day, and the truth that would eventually unravel everything she thought she knew about the man she married, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There are 3 questions that will define everything that follows, and none of them have easy answers. Who is the woman sitting across from Mark Bennett, wearing Claire's exact face as though it were borrowed rather than her own? Why has Mark spent 8 years of marriage never once mentioning that such a woman exists in his life? And what is coming for Claire that is so much larger than a simple case of infidelity, something that will force her to question not only her marriage, but her own identity, her own history, and the very foundation of the family she believed she came from? Claire didn't know it yet, standing in her living room with a phone still warm in her hand, but she was about to begin an investigation that would end not with proof of betrayal, but with a discovery that would change the meaning of the word family for the rest of her life. She called Mark. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice light, unbothered, exactly as it always sounded. She asked him where he was. He said the office, same as always, voice steady enough that for one terrible moment, Claire wondered if Denise had simply been mistaken, if grief and stress had conjured a resemblance where none truly existed. But Denise did not make mistakes like that. Not about something this specific, this exact. Claire asked him a second question, careful, testing. Had he seen anyone that day who reminded him of her? There was a pause on the line, brief, almost imperceptible, the kind of pause a person might not notice unless they were listening for exactly that kind of silence. "No," Mark said. "Why would you ask that?" And in that half-second of hesitation before his answer, Claire felt something inside her marriage begin to come apart at a seam she hadn't known was there. What Claire did not yet understand was that the woman in that cafe was not simply a stranger who happened to share her face by some improbable accident of nature. The truth waiting for her was older than her marriage, older than her friendship with Denise, older even than her own earliest memories. It reached back to a hospital room she had no recollection of, a decision made by people she never knew, and a secret that had been sitting quietly inside her husband's past for longer than she had been alive in his world. Claire believed she was about to uncover an affair. She had no idea she was about to uncover a sister. To understand what Claire Bennett was about to lose and what she was about to gain, it helps to go back to the very beginning of her story, long before Mark, long before the cafe, long before a phone call would split her life into a before and an after. Claire was adopted as an infant by a couple in Asheville, North Carolina, who had waited nearly a decade to become parents and who loved her, from the first day they held her, with a fierceness that never once wavered. She grew up in a warm house full of family photographs, birthday traditions, and the ordinary comfort of two people who chose her on purpose. And yet, underneath that love, there had always been a small, quiet space inside Claire that felt unfinished, a question mark she rarely spoke aloud, but never fully stopped carrying. Her adoptive parents had been honest with her from an early age, careful and gentle about the fact that she had come to them through adoption, and they had given her, when she turned 18, a manila folder containing whatever non-identifying information the agency had been willing to release. Claire kept that folder in the bottom drawer of her childhood dresser for years, moved it with her from apartment to apartment, and never once opened it. Part of her told herself she simply hadn't found the right moment. Another part of her, the part she rarely examined too closely, was afraid of what opening it might unravel, afraid that curiosity about a past she never knew might somehow feel like betrayal to the parents who had raised her with such devotion. She met Mark Bennett at 26, at a mutual friend's dinner party, and what drew her to him was not fireworks or drama, but something steadier, a sense that he was exactly who he presented himself to be. He listened when she talked. He remembered small details from conversations weeks earlier. He proposed on a quiet Tuesday evening, rather than some elaborate public spectacle, because he said he wanted the moment to belong only to the two of them. Their marriage, in the years that followed, was built on precisely that kind of steadiness. Sunday mornings with coffee on the porch, small inside jokes worn smooth from years of repetition, the particular comfort of a life built alongside someone you no longer had to perform for. By their 8th anniversary, Claire believed she knew Mark as completely as one person can know another. But there was one detail, small enough to explain away for years, that Claire had never quite managed to reason through. Every year, on the same date in early autumn, Mark grew distant, in a way that had nothing to do with work stress or ordinary bad moods. He would go quiet for an evening, sometimes two, offering vague explanations about being tired or preoccupied, and Claire had learned, without ever discussing it directly, not to press him on those particular days. She noticed, too, that he kept a locked drawer in his study, a small detail so unremarkable in 8 years of marriage that she had stopped consciously registering it at all. Once, searching for a stapler, she had found the drawer unlocked and glimpsed a photograph inside before quickly closing it again, telling herself it was none of her business, that everyone was entitled to some small private corner of themselves. The photograph had shown a woman Claire didn't recognize, younger than Mark, standing beside him in what looked like an old apartment Claire had never seen in any of his stories about his 20s. She hadn't asked him about it. It hadn't seemed important enough at the time to risk the kind of conversation that might make him feel surveilled rather than loved. Marriages, she told herself, are allowed to have small, unexplained corners, so long as the whole of the structure remains sound. She had believed, right up until the afternoon her phone rang in the middle of folding laundry, that whatever quiet history lived behind that locked drawer was small enough not to matter. She had no way of knowing that the woman in that photograph and the woman Denise had just seen sitting across from her husband were one and the same person. Denise Ortiz had been Claire's closest friend since their first year of college, the kind of friendship built less on shared interests than on an almost instinctive mutual loyalty. Where Claire tended to give people the benefit of the doubt, long past the point most would consider reasonable, Denise asked the hard questions first and softened them later if they turned out to be unnecessary. It was Denise who had sat with Claire through the death of her adoptive mother 4 years earlier, Denise who had talked her through every major decision of her adult life, Denise whose judgment Claire trusted more completely than almost anyone else's, including, as it would soon turn out, her own husband's version of events. When Denise called that afternoon, breathless and certain of what she had seen, Claire did not doubt her for even a moment. She simply had no framework yet for understanding what that certainty was about to cost her. What Claire did not yet know, standing in her living room, replaying the sound of Mark's hesitation on the phone, was that the woman in the locked drawers photograph, the woman Denise had seen wearing Claire's own face, and the sealed adoption folder gathering dust in the back of Claire's closet, were all pieces of a single story that had been quietly running parallel to her own life for 34 years. Mark had a past he had never fully explained. Claire had an origin she had never fully investigated, and somewhere between those two unexamined histories was a truth large enough to explain not just one afternoon's confusion, but the entire shape of both of their lives before they had ever met each other. That evening, when Mark came home from what he had called a long day at the office, Claire watched him hang his jacket in its usual place, pour himself a glass of water, and ask about her day with the same easy tone he always used, as though nothing about the last several hours had been unusual at all. She let him finish the small talk before she asked the question directly. Had he been at a downtown cafe that afternoon, with a woman who looked remarkably like her? Mark's face changed for only a fraction of a second, so briefly that Claire might have missed it if she hadn't been watching for exactly that reaction, and then he said, evenly, that he had no idea what she was talking about, that he hadn't been anywhere near downtown, that he didn't know any woman who could possibly be described that way. It was a complete denial, immediate and absolute, and it was the first time in 8 years of marriage that Claire felt certain, without a shred of doubt, that her husband was lying to her. She didn't argue with him that night. She had learned early in their marriage that confrontation rarely produced honesty when someone had already decided to hide something, and so instead of pushing further, Claire simply nodded, said she must have misunderstood Denise's description, and let the conversation drop. But something had shifted permanently inside her. She thought about the locked drawer in his study, the photograph she had glimpsed years earlier and never asked about, the particular date every autumn when Mark grew distant and offered no explanation. For the first time, those small, unremarkable details began to arrange themselves into a pattern, and the pattern frightened her more than any single piece of evidence could have on its own. That night, after Mark had fallen asleep, Claire lay awake beside him and made a decision she never thought she would make about her own marriage. She decided to investigate. She started with the credit card statements, something she had access to but had never once thought to examine closely in 8 years together, because there had never been a reason to. Buried among ordinary charges for gas and groceries and the occasional client dinner, she found a recurring payment to a storage facility on the outskirts of town, a facility Mark had never mentioned in all their years of marriage. She found, too, a charge from the same downtown cafe Denise had described, dated the exact afternoon of the sighting, at almost the exact time Mark had insisted he'd been nowhere near that part of the city. Claire sat at the kitchen table with the statements spread in front of her, her hands steady in a way that surprised her, given how unsteady everything inside her felt. She was no longer looking for reassurance. She was looking for the truth, whatever shape it turned out to take. The phone records took longer to piece together, but patience was something Claire had never lacked. Over the following days, she noticed a number that appeared with quiet regularity, always brief calls, always late in the evening, when Claire assumed Mark was catching up on emails in his study. She didn't call the number herself, not yet. Instead, she searched it, carefully, the way a person searches for something they both desperately want and desperately fear to find. And after several dead ends, a name surfaced that meant nothing to her, and yet somehow felt as though it should. Vanessa Cole. Claire said the name aloud to herself in the empty kitchen, testing its weight, waiting to see if it triggered any memory, any flicker of recognition. It didn't. Vanessa Cole was a stranger to her in every sense except one, the one Denise had described without knowing its significance. A woman who wore Claire's own face. Claire called Denise that night and told her everything. The credit card charges, the storage unit, the name that had surfaced from nowhere and now seemed to be at the center of everything. Denise listened without interrupting, the way she always did when something mattered enough to require her full attention. And when Claire finished, Denise asked the question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the phone call at the cafe. Did Claire think Mark was having an affair? Claire didn't have an answer yet. not a certain one. But she told Denise she intended to find out, whatever it took, whatever it cost her. Denise offered to help however she could, and for the first time since the phone call that had started all of this, Claire felt less alone inside a situation that had otherwise made her feel entirely unmoored from her own life. The storage unit was the next thread Claire pulled, and it was there, in a unit rented under Mark's name that she had never known existed, that she found the box that would change everything. Inside, beneath old tax documents and photographs from what appeared to be Mark's early 20s, Claire found a folded legal document that made her chest tighten before she had even fully unfolded it. It was a marriage certificate. Mark's name was on it, clearly, unmistakably, dated more than a decade before he had ever met Claire. And beside his name, in the space reserved for the other party, was a name Claire had only just learned to recognize: Vanessa Cole. Claire stood alone in that storage unit, holding proof of a marriage her husband had never once mentioned in 8 years together, and understood, with a certainty that made the ground feel unsteady beneath her, that everything she thought she knew about the man she married had just become a question with no easy answer. Claire did not confront Mark about the marriage certificate right away. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that the moment she revealed what she knew, Mark would have the chance to shape the story before she had gathered enough of it herself. So instead, she kept the discovery to herself, and over the following days, she pieced together what she could of a decade-old marriage her husband had never once mentioned. Public records confirmed what the certificate had already told her, that Mark had married a woman named Vanessa Cole in his mid-20s, and that the marriage had ended in divorce less than 3 years later, filed quietly, with no children listed and no dramatic public trail. It was, on paper, an unremarkable chapter of a young man's life. What made it remarkable was that he had buried it so completely that his own wife of 8 years had never known it existed. Claire decided she needed to see Vanessa in person, not to confront her, not yet, but simply to understand what she was dealing with. She arranged, through a mutual contact she found buried in old social media connections, a reason to be in the same coffee shop at the same time, telling herself it was reconnaissance rather than confrontation. When Vanessa Cole walked through the door, Claire felt the air leave her lungs in a way she hadn't fully prepared for, even having braced herself for days. It was not simply resemblance, it was her own face, her own posture, the same small mole near the left eyebrow that Denise had described with such certainty over the phone. Claire sat frozen at her table, watching a stranger move through the world wearing features she had only ever seen in mirrors and photographs. And for a moment, she forgot entirely why she had come. In those first days after seeing Vanessa in person, Claire's mind kept returning to the simplest, most painful explanation available to her. Mark had married this woman years ago, divorced her, and somehow, whether by coincidence or something far more calculated, found his way back to a woman who looked exactly like his first wife. Claire began to wonder whether their entire marriage had been built on some version of that resemblance, whether Mark had been drawn to her not for who she was, but for who she reminded him of, a living echo of a marriage he had never fully let go. She wondered if the recent cafe meeting was proof that Mark had reconnected with Vanessa, that perhaps he had never truly ended things, that the timeline of his first divorce and their own courtship had been arranged, deliberately, to look like nothing more than an unrelated coincidence. That theory held for exactly as long as it took Denise to make a phone call. Claire had mentioned, almost as an aside during one of their long conversations, that she had never opened the sealed adoption folder her parents had given her all those years ago, and Denise, always the one to ask the question Claire was too afraid to ask herself, suggested they look into it properly, using whatever public adoption registries might exist for cases like Claire's. Claire agreed, mostly to give herself something productive to do with the fear that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. Denise spent an entire weekend cross-referencing dates, hospital records, and registry databases, the kind of patient, methodical work that had always been her particular gift, while Claire tried and failed to concentrate on anything else in her life. Denise called on a Sunday evening, her voice carrying a different kind of tension than it had during that first call at the cafe, quieter, more careful, as though she understood the fragility of what she was about to say. She had found a match in the registry, a record showing that a second infant had been placed for adoption the very same week, from the very same hospital as Claire. The record was incomplete, careful about names in the way adoption registries often are, but the dates lined up exactly, down to the day. Claire sat with the phone pressed to her ear, unable to speak for a long moment, because she already understood, before Denise even finished the sentence, exactly whose name was likely to be attached to that second record. Vanessa Cole had not simply resembled Claire by strange coincidence. Vanessa Cole may have been born beside her. While Claire absorbed this possibility in the quiet of her own home, replaying every assumption she had made over the past several weeks, Vanessa Cole was going through a reckoning of her own, one Claire knew nothing about. Vanessa had reached out to Mark months earlier, not out of romantic interest, but because a private search into her own biological family had led her, improbably, back to the one man she had once been married to and never fully understood why she'd lost. She had not known, walking into that downtown cafe, that Mark had remarried. She certainly had not known that his current wife would turn out to share her exact face. Vanessa had spent weeks searching for the family she never had, only to discover that the family she was looking for might already be sitting across the table from her former husband, wearing her own features without either of them realizing it. The two women, unknown to each other, unknowingly connected by blood, biology, and one man's carefully guarded silence, were both approaching the same devastating truth from opposite directions. Claire dreaded what confirmation might mean for the life she had built with Mark. Vanessa feared what it might mean for the fragile hope she had allowed herself to feel after years of searching for a family she had never known. And Mark, aware now that both women were circling closer to a truth he had spent over a decade avoiding, found himself running out of ways to keep the past and present from finally colliding. Claire scheduled a DNA test before she allowed herself to fully believe what Denise's research suggested, needing proof beyond documents and resemblance, needing to hear the truth stated plainly rather than assembled from fragments. She did not yet know that the results would arrive not as an answer, but as the beginning of an entirely new set of questions. The DNA results arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered in the plain, clinical language such reports always use, entirely unequipped to convey the weight of what they confirmed. Claire and Vanessa were not simply related, they were identical twins, separated at birth, placed into two entirely different families through the same closed adoption process 34 years earlier. Claire read the report twice, then a third time, as though repetition might soften the impact of language that refused to soften on its own. She had spent weeks bracing herself for the possibility of an affair, for betrayal in its most familiar form, and instead, she was holding proof that the woman with her own face was not a rival for her husband's affection, but a sister she had never known she was allowed to miss. The grief that moved through her in that moment was unlike anything she had prepared for. Claire asked Mark to sit down with her that evening, and for the first time in 8 years of marriage, she watched him struggle to find words at all. He confirmed what the documents had already shown her. He had married Vanessa when he was 26, young and certain in the way only the very young can be certain, and the marriage had ended less than 3 years later, when Vanessa discovered he had been unfaithful, a mistake he described with visible shame, rather than excuse. He told Claire that after the divorce, he had buried that entire chapter of his life, ashamed of the person he had been within it, and had never spoken of Vanessa again to anyone, including, eventually, to himself. When he met Claire years later, he insisted, with what appeared to be genuine anguish, that he had never once suspected any connection between the two women. He had simply fallen in love again, and he had chosen, out of shame rather than malice, never to revisit a past he had worked hard to leave behind. Claire wanted desperately to believe him, and in the end, she found that she mostly did. The lie he had told her in the kitchen that first evening, the flat denial that he knew any woman matching Vanessa's description, had not been the lie of a man protecting an affair. It had been the reflexive lie of a man, terrified that the past he had buried was finally clawing its way back into the present, threatening to unravel a second marriage the same way shame had already cost him a first. That distinction mattered to Claire, though it did not erase the deeper wound underneath it. Mark had known, for the entire duration of their marriage, that he had once been married to a woman who could have been Claire's twin, and he had never once thought to mention the resemblance, never once considered that the coincidence might matter to the wife who had spent her whole life wondering about a family she never had access to. The grief Claire carried in the days that followed was, she realized, a grief with two entirely separate sources, each one significant enough to have devastated her on its own. The first was the ordinary, familiar pain of discovering that her husband had hidden something enormous from her for the entirety of their marriage. A betrayal of omission rather than action, but a betrayal nonetheless. The second was something far less ordinary, a grief for the 34 years she had spent without knowing a sister existed, without knowing that somewhere in the world there had been another version of herself growing up in a different home, shaped by different circumstances, and yet bound to her by something no amount of distance or silence had managed to erase. Claire found herself unable to fully separate these two griefs from each other, each one intensifying the ache of the other in ways she hadn't anticipated. Vanessa's reckoning, arriving at nearly the same moment as Claire's, carried its own particular cruelty. She had spent the better part of a year searching quietly for any information about her biological family, driven by a longing she had carried since childhood, only ever half acknowledged even to herself. She had never expected that search to lead her back to Mark, the man she had once loved and eventually left, and she certainly had never expected to learn that the family she had spent a year searching for had, in some strange and unbearable sense, already found its way into her ex-husband's life, years before she ever thought to look. Vanessa had walked into that downtown cafe, hoping only to understand more about her own history. She left it understanding that her closest living relative was married to the man she had once promised to spend her life with, and that neither of them had known it until a chance encounter forced the truth into the open. Claire and Vanessa met again, deliberately this time, in the week following the DNA results, sitting across from each other at a quiet table, with none of the confusion or suspicion that had defined their first meeting. There was very little to say at first, both women searching each other's faces for some trace of the years they had spent apart, some evidence of the life the other had lived without her. What emerged instead, slowly, was something neither of them had expected to feel amid so much upheaval, a fragile, tentative recognition that despite everything, despite the pain Mark's silence had caused both of them, they had found something that had been missing from both of their lives for over 3 decades. It did not undo the betrayal. It did not resolve the complicated, aching question of what Claire's marriage would become in the aftermath of this revelation. But it gave both women something neither Mark's shame nor his silence had ever managed to take from them: a sister, finally known, finally real. Claire believed, in the days following her conversation with Mark, that she finally had the complete picture, painful as it was. A first marriage buried out of shame, a chance resemblance that had led two strangers back into each other's lives, through no design of anyone involved. A husband who had lied out of fear rather than malice, and a sister discovered by accident rather than deception. It was a difficult truth, but it was one Claire had begun, cautiously, to make peace with. That fragile peace lasted exactly as long as it took Vanessa to mention, almost in passing during one of their long, careful conversations, a detail that did not fit the timeline Mark had given his wife at all. Vanessa explained that she had reached out to Mark months before that afternoon at the downtown cafe, long before Denise had ever made her phone call, long before Claire had ever suspected anything was wrong in her marriage. Vanessa had found him through the same biological family search that had eventually led her to Claire, and she had contacted him directly, explaining that her search for her birth family had led her back to him, her former husband, in a coincidence she herself found almost impossible to believe. She told Claire, gently but plainly, that Mark had known, for months, that his ex-wife was searching for biological relatives. She told Claire that Mark had known, before Denise ever saw them together in that cafe, that Vanessa believed she might have a twin somewhere in the world. Claire sat with this new information, the way a person sits with a wound they had believed was already closing, only to discover it had never actually begun to heal. Mark had not simply failed to mention an old marriage out of shame, a mistake she had been prepared, however painfully, to forgive. He had known, months in advance, that the woman who had once been his wife believed she had a twin sister somewhere in the world, and he had said absolutely nothing to Claire, not when Vanessa first reached out, not in the weeks that followed, not even after Denise's phone call had already exposed the connection between them. He had let Claire discover, through credit card statements and storage units and a stranger's face in a coffee shop, a truth He could have simply told her himself, gently, on his own terms, at any point in the preceding months. The question Claire now had to sit with was no longer whether Mark's silence had come from malice or shame. It was whether a marriage could survive the discovery that the person she trusted most had watched her walk, unknowingly, toward a truth this significant, and had chosen, again and again, across months of opportunity, to say nothing at all. Claire thought about the 8 years behind her, the ordinary Sunday mornings, the quiet comfort of a life she had believed was fully known to both of them. She thought, too, about the 34 years she had spent without a sister, years Mark's silence had extended by months that could have been spent differently, had he simply told her the truth the moment Vanessa first reached out to him. In the end, Claire's decision about her marriage mattered less to her than a different, quieter realization she arrived at somewhere in the middle of those difficult weeks. Whatever became of her life with Mark, whether the marriage could be rebuilt on a foundation this deeply disturbed, or whether it had already fractured beyond repair, Claire had gained something Mark's silence had never managed to prevent. She had a sister. She had 34 years of questions that were finally, however painfully, beginning to find answers. And she had learned, in the hardest possible way, that the family she had been given was not the only family she had ever had a right to. What this story leaves behind is a question worth sitting with, long after the details of Claire, Mark, and Vanessa have faded from memory. We build our closest relationships on the assumption that we know the people we love completely, that 8 years, or 10, or 30 are enough time to uncover everything worth knowing about another person. But every relationship contains locked drawers, sealed folders, quiet dates on a calendar that are never fully explained. The question is not whether those hidden corners exist. They almost always do. The question is what we do when we finally find them, and whether the people we love have earned, through everything else they have given us, the chance to be forgiven for what they chose not to say. If the person you loved most had been hiding your other half all along, would you forgive the omission, or only the discovery